Hello, and thank you for tuning into this week's episode of Bite-Sized Cybercrime, the podcast where we discuss cybercrimes and cybersecurity news. On May 20th, it was confirmed that GitHub, of all websites, was breached via an attacker who stole thousands of internal repos. Team PCP quickly took responsibility for the attack. Yesterday, they published to a prominent dark web data breach forum that they would be selling the internal source code and organizational data stolen from GitHub. They claimed that they had approximately 4,000 repos of private code, according to their advertisement. There was no ransomware or extortion of GitHub involved. Data was stolen, but GitHub didn't have any malware on their systems. Well, there may have been some malware responsible for exfiltrating the data, but you could also just do that with simple scripts, which is really just taking it out of GitHub's environment and moving it on to the hacker's environment. But operations were as normal as they could still access everything. This, of course, is a more stealthy approach to ransomware, quote-unquote, but it may not be as profitable as you don't get the ransom from GitHub. However, I would say for GitHub specifically, this may actually work really well. Although Microsoft has owned GitHub since about 2018, people who are mad about that have been wanting alternatives for quite some time. And recently, Microsoft has been getting more aggressive with Microsoft-defying GitHub. If you know what that means, you know what that means. There's a bunch of new AI integrations, and people are worrying that GitHub may not become as user-friendly as it was in the past due to the nature of being owned by Microsoft. I think Microsoft knows this and isn't going to tank it too far, but still there's always going to be people who will seek other options for this. So, having the source code of GitHub may allow people to create something very similar as a direct competitor to GitHub. It's hard to believe anything would be as big as GitHub currently is, given its very long history, but it's always possible, and people are always looking for other options on the market. Team PCP did say that if no one bought the data, they would link it for free. However, this could also turn out very interesting, and I think this will actually motivate people to buy it more than you may think. Why would anyone buy a bunch of data that someone says is going to be leaked for free anyways if they don't buy it? That's because people may want exclusive access to this data. They're not necessarily buying the data, but they're buying the ability for no one else in the world to have the data, which is the important part. The data itself is incredibly valuable, but being the exclusive owners of the data may be even more valuable, even if it's not necessarily something you can act on immediately. That's why I don't think they'll have a problem selling it, but ultimately we'll see. People may be hesitant to buy it if they think it's just gonna get leaked anyways. Team PCP is not a ransomware group I talk about very much, but they are most well known for their software supply chain attacks. They often compromise open source software in hopes that it will trickle down to the actual targets they want to compromise, which is people who are using that software. This exact method was in fact used to compromise GitHub, which is a very, very big target. So let's get into what happened. How do you steal all of the source code from GitHub, the GitHub owned by Microsoft? GitHub confirmed that they detected and contained a device, one that was compromised and owned by an employee. There was a malicious VS Code extension on the device. This wasn't the result of a phishing attack or installing just a fake malicious extension randomly on the internet. No. This extension was legitimate, but it was compromised by Team PCP and made malicious, effectively being poisoned. That exact extension was unnamed, but many developers use open source extensions as a way to enhance the code they write. A well-known and widely considered safe extension, being poisoned, is going to be, of course, incredibly dangerous for a lot of people who are using it. It's very likely that the developer who is using it did not even notice that anything was wrong, because they're not trying to make it obvious. The malicious part of it is going to run in the background, mostly unnoticed and unseen except by logs aggregated by forwarders on devices. It is simply lucky, or rather unlucky, depending on how you look at it, that someone working at GitHub happened to install this malicious extension that Team PCP had control over. Security teams at GitHub removed the malicious extension and isolated that specific computer. This is just in case any other malware on the device could still be causing issues, and to ensure that it doesn't spread to other devices, which is potentially a problem. GitHub confirmed that the amount of repos that Team PCP reported to having is accurate, slightly less than what was claimed, though. There are about 3,800 repos than the full 4,000, but it was an approximation after all. GitHub was also quick to rotate secrets so that any secrets or passwords stolen could not be used, and they are continuing to monitor the situation to make sure the incident is fully contained. Ultimately, all good steps to take looking forward, and it seems like there don't really need to be any disclosures because no specific private user data was stolen. It seems to have mostly been source code and a bit of internal data. Nothing that could compromise someone's identity. GitHub isn't quite on the level of like a health insurance or a financial services company where you have a ton of PII in them, but they do have some paid subscriptions and premium features like GitHub Codepilot, Codespaces, and some enterprise plans for organizations, but those, at least from what I can tell, have been unaffected by this data breach. And of course, users are still able to use it normally. The site was never down because there was no ransomware that was actually affecting it. Some people, and even articles I've read, are very quick to just blame the employee for this data breach, but really, it's not their fault. This is a tricky thing to navigate. You like to assume that extensions you've been using for a long time are completely safe, and that any updates you get for them are safe. Sadly, this isn't always the case, as supply chain attacks can happen. They're not as common, but when they happen, they hit very hard. That was clearly the case here. I think anyone would feel pretty bad if they had completely unintentionally caused a whole massive cybersecurity incident like this, but realistically, the extension is just a foothold into the environment. Other security controls were perhaps lacking in some spaces that allowed all of this particular data theft to occur. A single employee typically won't have that much access to absolutely everything, and they shouldn't, so it's very likely that methods to compromise other accounts were taken. Of course, I don't work at GitHub, I don't have the full story, but it is something to consider, is that security needs to have a lot of layers to it. If a hacker gets a foothold, it should be made very difficult for them to do anything with that foothold. I hope you enjoyed this week's episode of Bite-Sized Cybercrime. Thank you for listening, and of course, thank you to TechCrunch, Cybersecurity Dive, TechRadar, and Wired for information on this attack and subsequent data breach. And until next time, stay secure.